Good afternoon. My name is Patricia Banks, and I am professor and chair of sociology at Mount Holyoke College. And I am delighted to be here today to talk about my new book, Black Culture, Inc.
That's right. And we have a copy of the book at the library, so they can check it out. I guess my first question is, why did you write the book and what did you hope to accomplish with it?
Thank you. So just to tell you a little bit of background, so I'll tell you that this is my fourth book that looks at issues related to race and consumption. And so my first book, Represent Art and Identity Among the Black Upper Middle Class, is a study of art collectors. And my second book, Diversity and Philanthropy at African American Museums, is a book that looks at patronage at African American museums by individuals. And so I was partly curious about trying to understand corporate support of Black culture, because in the course of doing research for that second book, I noticed as I was visiting museums that you would often see evidence of corporate support. So you'd see names on donor walls, and if you'd look through annual reports, you'd see corporations being thanked. So I decided that I wanted to get a better sense of why corporations were supporting Black culture. So in ethnic community, in Black Culture, Inc., I use the case of Black cultural patronage by corporations to understand ethnic community support more broadly. And so ethnic community support is philanthropy and sponsorships that are focused on racial and ethnic minorities. And so Black cultural patronage by corporations is it's a form of ethnic community support. And while we typically think about ethnic community support as altruistic, in Black Culture, Inc., I show how it is also partly self-interested. And what I show is how corporations use Black cultural patronage as a form of what I call diversity capital, or it's a practice through which they project an image of themselves as valuing racial and ethnic minorities, as well as equity and inclusion. In many cases, this is a win-win. So ethnic community support for companies is a form of diversity capital. For nonprofits and other recipients, it provides needed resources, and the public benefits in many ways too, in that, for example, when it comes to Black culture, the public has greater access to Black culture because the institutions like museums, like theaters that support it do have the financial resources that they need. In some cases, though, there can be a cost. And one of those costs is that in some cases, ethnic community support presents a racial image of companies that is partly at odds with reality. So I really see Black Culture, Inc. as a book that not only speaks to questions about corporate support of the arts and corporate support of racial and ethnic minority initiatives, but also some of the bigger questions that we're all grappling with today, such as what is the potential and what is the limits for corporations to solve social problems such as racial and ethnic inequality. And then also this question of what is the role of philanthropy in social change?
And I think that's one of the things that struck me so strongly about the book is this idea of philanthropy and social change, and how, so maybe you could speak a little bit more about how corporations borrow, benefit from, because we understand, I think it's understood how we benefit from it. You know, if a museum is funded, we get to go to it, but how does the corporation benefit?
I think it's a really important question. And I think part of it has to do with, if we think about the contemporary environment that corporations are operating in, there is a real need for them to present an image as valuing diversity and inclusion. Corporations always have this need for legitimacy. There's always this need for legitimacy. But when we look at the contemporary society, there's a greater need for legitimacy around race and ethnicity. And there are many different reasons for that. One has to do with the changing racial and ethnic demographics. So if we think about the consumer marketplace, there are more racial and ethnic minorities. And so there is a desire for some of those consumers to see themselves reflected in brands. So that's a need. There's also, if we think about just broader expectations, that companies are fair and inclusive. And that is something that is important for corporations to signal to the general market, so non-racial and ethnic minority consumers as well. And so if we think about this issue of corporate responsibility, and in some of my research, I've described it as racial responsibility, corporate racial responsibility, corporations need to be able to demonstrate that they are good corporate citizens, they're good racial citizens, and they're doing the right things along these lines. And so ethnic community support becomes a mechanism through which they're able to do this. So there's, on one hand, there is this need for the marketplace. There's this need for the marketplace. So how do we appeal to consumers? And then there's also just this broader issue of what do we need to do to signal to the public that we are responsible? And I think in the contemporary era, that increasingly does involve demonstrating that one is responsible around race. An example of that is in the last chapter. So the last chapter of Black Culture Inc., it opens with companies giving to Black cultural initiatives, such as an institution such as the National Museum of African American History and Culture, in the wake of the 2020 racial uprisings. So this is a moment where companies need to signal to the public that they are responsible around race and ethnicity. So we need to show that we are doing the right thing. And so these gifts become a way to signal that. And so again, the institution, in this case, the cultural institution, benefits because those funds are always needed. Smithsonian museums, the funding model is a public-private partnership. So some of that funding comes from the government, but it's also expected that funding comes from private citizens, that it comes from foundations, and it comes from corporations. And so that's a benefit there. And then of course, the public benefits from that, and that the public, that's a museum that's open to people in the United States, people who are visiting the United States from across the world.
Yes, and I would kind of like to talk about, in regards to that, the two things that kind of struck me prior to the George Floyd Black Lives Matter moment that we had the last couple of years was the example you gave of Dances with Wolves and The Birth of a Nation, Nat Turner movies, where corporations borrowed authenticity, I guess would be one way to say it, for their product in cultivating a consumer. And we can talk about Kool too, if that's a better example, but.
Yeah, so exactly. So those are both really wonderful examples of, and I talked a little bit earlier about the need for a positive racial image. And so you have one in terms of corporate citizenship, we are a good company doing the right thing. And then there's also the marketing. So how do we make our products and services, how do we enhance their appeal to consumers? And so really, I think it's a really fun, a very interesting example in one of the chapters, because one of the chapters looks at the Smithsonian Institution, and I look at corporate support of various Smithsonian museums, including but not limited to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and also the National Museum of the American Indian. And so what we see in both of those cases is we see film companies giving gifts to museums to enhance the authenticity of film. So in the case of Orion Pictures, a gift to the National Museum of the American Indian. In the case of 21st Century Fox, we saw a gift to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And so what happens is that when companies are giving gifts is they give the gifts. So you have this material exchange of resources, but there's also this discursive element. There's a discursive element where the gifts are written about and they are discussed in various communication channels. So what will happen is that it will be written about in own media, such as press releases and blogs, and in some cases, even producing videos. And so what will happen is they will place the gift in context. And so what happened with 21st Century Fox is they used the gift to the National Museum of African American History and Culture to promote the film in essence. And what we have to remember is that that film was, it's based on a historical, it's based on the past. And so there was a real emphasis, if we looked at the broader marketing of the film, to emphasize that this is based on a true story. And so the association with a Black History Museum really helped to reinforce that meaning, that this is a very authentic telling of this story.
Well, and yeah, and that's one of the things that was, as a historian, it's interesting to think about how, I think you called it diversity washing, maybe, or diversity framing, but the idea that like Walmart or some other corporation can use a picture of Martin Luther King for civil rights, but it'll kind of erase the dogs and the hoses. And they kind of choose their image in the museum deals with the entire history, difficult and all that. And then the corporation kind of uses it. Do you understand where I'm getting?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay,
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And so I talk about this. There's a chapter on Dennys and their gift to the National Civil Rights Museum. And of course, those of you who are old enough remember that at one point in time, Dennys was accused by several customers of racial discrimination. And so there was a settlement that at that point in time was the biggest settlement for a case of that nature. It was over $50 million. And so the company has really suffered since then with what I describe in Black Culture Inc. Is at that moment, they suffered a racial image crisis. They suffered a racial image crisis at that moment. And they've continued to, and since those decades, there's this collective memory about the company. And part of that is this is a company that some people view as, they remember, and they think about it as a company that's discriminated against Black and other customers who are from racial and ethnic and other minority groups. And so what happens is at one point in time, the company gives a very generous donation to the National Civil Rights Museum. And so this gift becomes a way to project an image of the company as a good racial citizen, And again, if we think about the communication channels about the gift, they tell the story about what they have done in the intervening years, that the fact that their suppliers, they have a fairly relatively high level of Black suppliers. If they look at the board, that the company has really changed. And so that's part of what I call diversity framing, and that's the use of words, images, and sounds in the communication about these gifts that reinforces the meanings of these gifts as this is a company, we are a company that cares about diversity, that cares about, in the case of Black community support, African Americans. And so we see this happening with the communication about the Dennys gift. But what's also fascinating is the kind of narrative that gets told about civil rights and some of these communication channels is a very uplifting narrative about civil rights. So this narrative of Martin Luther King was a great person, that our country through Martin Luther King has come to a place where racial and ethnic minorities are interacting with each other, kind of come to a good place. And what's important to think about is that it makes sense that that would be the narrative about civil rights that the company would tell in its communication about its gift to the National Civil Rights Museum, because the purpose of the gift at that point in time is to reconstruct the public image, because again, the public image is that of a company that is linked to discrimination. So what is effective then is to link the gift and tell a story of a history of the United States where there's racial harmony, where there's racial equality, where African Americans and white Americans are interacting on an equal playing field. And so that it makes sense that that's what would take place, because the function of the gift for the company is to project a positive racial image.
Excellent. Yes, excellent. Now, and continuing the idea of the narrative, I'd kind of like to talk about menthol cigarettes, because they're back in the news a little bit with some stuff that's going on. But I was really intrigued by your chapter on the Kool Jazz Fest. And I remember those happening. I mean, I'm old enough to remember those. So, but I was also struck by this statistic that 85% of Black smokers smoked menthol. And that narrative, I guess, was created in part by Kool and this whole, so maybe you could talk a little bit about how that functions and works.
You're right. Menthol cigarettes are back in the news. So last week, the FDA announced its intentions to place a ban on menthol flavor in cigarettes and some other tobacco products. And this is associated with race, because as you just noted, even today, around 85% of Black smokers use menthol cigarettes, as opposed to, I believe it's around 30% of white smokers. And so public health advocates, some public health advocates have described this African Americanization of menthol cigarettes. So how does that happen? And so in Black Culture Inc., I have a chapter on the Kool Jazz Festival, which helps us to understand the history of this. And so again, some of you may remember, but the Kool Jazz Festival was one of the biggest music festivals in the United States, and it featured not only African American and other jazz artists, but also rhythm and blues music as well. And it was sponsored by Brown and Williamson in the 1970s and 1980s. And at that point in time, Brown and Williamson was one of the biggest tobacco companies in the United States. And so what I describe in Black Culture Inc. is how the company used the sponsorship of this festival as a mechanism to project an image of itself as being good, a good company, producing good products, and caring about the African American community. And so when we think about the high percentage of African Americans who are smoking today, it's really important for us to look back, look back in the past to see what were some of the practices that were being used to essentially, cleanse the image of cigarette companies. Because one of the things we have to remember is that in the 1970s and 1980s, it was known that cigarettes could cause problems with health. And at that point in time, in fact, cigarettes were required to have on the box the Surgeon General's warning. And so one way to think about that is that these are products that there's a spoiling that's taken place when a product literally has to have on it that the Surgeon General is warning you about using it. The product has been spoiled in a way, and the company that has produced this product has been spoiled in a particular way. And so what happens then is the Kool Jazz Festival becomes this mechanism to repair the image of the company.
And I also like the focus you had on how Black media, especially the magazines, I think it was Ebony magazine, was, what was it? Wrote it down, 2 times the number of cigarette ads as Life magazine from the same period. So there's maybe it speaks to a bigger trend in what you're trying to do with the book as to why that might have happened.
So this fits in with, if we look at some of the public health, there's been some really fascinating research on public health and marketing of menthol cigarettes to African Americans. And what that research shows, and I talk about some of it in Black Culture Inc., is that there was targeted marketing of menthol cigarettes to African Americans. And one part of it was placing ads, really targeting African American media, magazines and newspapers with ads for menthol cigarettes. And so public health professionals have argued that this is one of the reasons that we see such high levels of menthol preference among Black smokers. And so Black Culture Inc. then tells the strand of this story of where the Kool Jazz Festival fits into this. So what you would have for the Kool Jazz Festival is you would have these advertisements in Black newspapers. And what you would see is you would see an advertisement for the Kool Jazz Festival. And what you'd also see in many of the advertisements is, in some cases, you'd literally see images of cigarette boxes. So it was this mechanism to promote the festival, but also very directly, in some cases, promoting the cigarettes to African Americans, because the Black media disproportionately has readers who are African American.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think also then we get into the Afropunk chapter, which kind of brings us up to date as to how some of these mechanisms work within the current media environment, and how corporations kind of use counterculture to create brand awareness, but also identity, maybe? Is that, yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the Afropunk chapter it's fascinating. So we have in Black Culture Inc. This chapter on the Kool Jazz Festival, which is historical big Black music festival. And then there's some chapters on contemporary music festivals, one of them being Afropunk. And so Afropunk is a music festival and it features punk musicians, so Black punk bands or bands that include people of African descent in them. And it's very, very interesting when you start to think about branding and Black kind of counterculture, because if we think about it, there are brands that have used hip hop music, rap musicians, as a way to signal that they are edgy and cool. And so what we see with the sponsorship is of Afropunk is it becomes another way that brands are able to project an image of the public of being cool, of being associated with Black people. And in that chapter, I talk about this process of what I call prosumption promotion. And so prosumption is this practice where we have individuals who are both consuming products and producing products. The classic case of prosumption is social media use. So when we all use our social media, we are creating posts, but we're also reading other people's posts. And so prosumption promotion is this practice in which we have individuals who are creating content that enhances the image of companies as well as enhances awareness. So one of the things that happens at Black music festivals and that are like Afropunk is that companies who have sponsors will host these booths. They'll host these booths, and oftentimes in the booths, they will have these highly designed, elaborate backdrops to take photos, because one of the things that people like to do when they're at music festivals is they like to take photos and then they like to post them on social media. And so companies will create these very intricately designed backdrops that are very visually appealing. But what they also include is they will also often include logos of companies. They will include hashtags associated with companies, and festival goers will be encouraged then to, when they post those photos to their social media channels, to use the corporate hashtags. And in cases where the backdrops include logos or include the company name, what's taking place there is that an image is being projected of these companies of being connected to Black culture. And in particular, when the festival goers are Black, and in many cases, the festival goers are in fact Black.
Yeah, and that prosumption was incredibly enlightening to me. It was a great way to describe what was going on there. So thank you for that. And I guess just kind of wrapping up, in talking to a friend the other night about the book, she was being very, I don't want to mischaracterize her point, but it was kind of like, this is what corporations do, right? So why, you kind of know where I'm going with this, where it's like, okay, so they're doing this, but is it necessarily bad? And are we criticizing it, or are we just acknowledging it? What do you think? What do you think the proper response to these tactics by corporations are?
Yeah, so Black Culture Inc. is really a book that's helping us to understand these processes and what's taking place. And I think that there are many different ways to consider practically, kind of what should happen, what should happen once we know this. And I think what you see with Black Culture Inc. is it's incredibly complicated, because in some ways, as I was noted, it's a win-win. So yes, companies are doing this, and the public wins, nonprofits and other recipients win. But in other cases, as we see with the chapter on the Kool Jazz Festival, we see some stakeholders, the company wins, and then some stakeholders are winning. For example, the artists who are performing, and we have to think about it's artists need to earn a living. And so they are benefiting from the sponsorship. The public is benefiting in some ways, in that the people who attended the Kool Jazz Festival got to experience this music, engage with this, the Black jazz musicians and rhythm and blues musicians. So those are benefits. But there was also, in this case, the cost, in that it was promoting a product that at that point in time, it was known that they did cause harm to health. So I think that Black Culture Inc. really just helps us to see how complicated this practice, how complicated ethnic community support by companies is in terms of its costs and benefits.
I'm sorry. Well, yes, that's a good answer, and I like it. So thank you for that. I can use that now. Is there anything you would like to kind of say that we haven't touched on, or what you would wrap up? If someone was going to take away from the book, what would be your major?
Yeah, well, thank you. So I hope that everybody has an opportunity to read Black Culture Inc. If you are a person who is interested in the arts, I think it will be of interest to you. If you're a person who's interested in these bigger questions, as I was saying today, I was saying a little earlier, related to the role of philanthropy and social change. And if you're interested in corporate social responsibility, I think that you will find Black Culture Inc. to be a book that helps you to think through some of these issues.
It definitely did that for me, so thank you. And I do have to ask, because the painting behind you is so wonderful, I think people are probably going to ask about it. So maybe if you'd like to tell a little bit about that painting. It's fantastic.
Sure, thank you. So this is a print by Jacob Lawrence. This is a print by Jacob Lawrence. And so he is an artist who is African-American. And so in my book, Represent Art and Identity Among the Black Upper Middle Class, this is a book where I do talk about his work a little bit. And I'll say in back of me, I do have a book by Alma Thomas. And so she also is an artist of African descent. And she was an artist who did abstract work. So both of them are great. And then on the top shelf, you can't quite see it, but that's a book about Jacob Lawrence. So